Welcome back. Talking to Michael Ventura, and today he's going to discuss some of the interviews that he's done. He's done quite a few interviews of prominent directors and writers. So why don't you start out from there, Michael?
All right. Well, one of the things about writing for LA Weekly, which we founded in 1978 and is still going on, although it's been sold a few times. But one of the things, especially in very late 70s and then into the 80s, when Hollywood was, the studios of LA were still the main studios. Now you've got what goes on in Georgia and what goes on in Canada and various other places, and a lot of studio offices in New York. But at the time, LA was still a hub of all that. And so if you were going to be interviewing a director or an actor, you were playing in front of his whole staff, of everybody he works with. This was going to get read in a way that it's not going to get read if you interview him in Austin, Texas, or even in New York City at that time. And there was a demand, consequently, that you have done your homework, that you be sharp. And the first interview I think of, when I think back to that, is my interview with Steven Spielberg when E.T. was about to come out. Now, E.T. was going to open big, but at the time, people generally didn't know what Steven Spielberg looked like. He directed that wonderful chase movie made for TV.
Yeah, Duel.
Dennis Weaver.
Yeah, Duel.
And Duel. And then he directed Jaws. And then he directed something called 1941, which is kind of a flop. But then he directed Close Encounters. And now he was coming out with a new film. By now, he'd made Jaws and Close Encounters. They were blockbusters. They were different. They were original in terms of their genres. They had done things people hadn't done before. And everybody was waiting for E.T. All they knew it was extraterrestrial. Now, he had also produced, but not directed, I think, Poltergeist. So he could go in all kinds of directions. Nobody knew where his career was going to go. Oh, he directed Raiders of the Lost Ark. So there was an Indiana Jones film. And they were keeping E.T. very hush-hush. We got a screening at the Weekly. We were invited to a screening, Ginger and I. And there was Charles Champlin of the LA Times. There was a guy from Rolling Stone. There was a guy from the New York Times. That was it. And it was several weeks before the release. And as far as we knew, they were giving out just 2 interviews pre-release. Spielberg was going to talk to Rolling Stone. It was going to be a cover story. And he was going to talk to me at LA Weekly, from LA Weekly. And they demanded to know, a guarantee that it would be a cover story. And I said, look, it's obvious we want to put him on the cover, but I don't know this guy. I don't know if he gets drunk. I don't know if he goes to an interview high. If it's a good interview, it'll be on the cover. I'm not guaranteeing it's going to be on the cover. It's in our interest to put it on the cover. But if it's a lousy interview, I'm not going to put it on the cover. And we danced around. They were talking to Ginger. They were talking to me. We danced around for a few days, and they finally said, okay, but it can only be a half hour long. And I said, forget it. I'm not going to try to stuff this time into a half hour. Give me an hour, and the photographer comes. We had our photographer come in the last 10 minutes of it to get the pictures. We went around on that for about a day or so. Finally, they gave in, gave me an hour. And because we had a policy of, we were going to be the newspaper that was not going to get pushed around in LA by the studios. And if that meant no Steven Spielberg interview, then that meant no Steven Spielberg interview. But they wanted it, and we wanted it, so it worked. So I get, he had a big office at MGM, and I knew how to get there and everything, and they told me we're in what building, and I go, and I knock on the door, and remember, as I said, Steven Spielberg's face was not familiar. I don't think I'd ever seen a picture of him. And there's a guy, he looks youngish, more or less my age, probably maybe a little younger. He's sitting on a sofa. There's video games and pinball machines in this huge office, and it's kind of messy, and he's eating out of a takeout box. And I looked at him and said, "Spielberg?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "You're just a kid." And he said, "Yeah, we're all kids around here." And we sat down. We were comfortable. And in an interview, I would try to do two things. I would try to, very important to me, to get something from the director or the actor that a young filmmaker would learn from. A young actor, a young wannabe director, a young editor, cameraman, that's something that would be useful to people interested in making pictures. And also, I wouldn't throw softballs. I wasn't out for any kind of gossip ever. I was always just out, for the creative process. Not a phrase I generally use, but that's the only one that's really apt. What is this creative process? And if I had any comments about that I wanted to talk about previous work. And so a very interesting thing with E.T. is at the time I did the interview, the ad campaign had not yet started. So when I saw E.T., it was with absolutely no conception of what the extraterrestrial looked like, no conception of are you trying to frighten us? Are you trying to entertain us? What are you trying to do? Nothing. And when you see E.T. that way, the first 15, 20 minutes of it are really scary. You don't know what's going to happen to the girl with E.T. in the closet. You don't know what E.T. is going to look like. You don't know where this movie's going. And then when you see the extraterrestrial and you start getting the vibe of that, you kind of relax because, okay, he's not trying to scare us to death. He's trying to give us some many-leveled entertainment here. So I was appalled when I saw the ad campaign because everybody knew what E.T. looked like before they got to the theater. So the ad campaign flashed, this is going to be a very nice movie. Well-made, entertaining, and all that, but basically its impulse is generous and friendly. And there's going to be tension, there's going to be all this stuff, but E.T. is going to pull through. You knew that from the ad campaign. And you didn't know that if you just put the film on and watched it and you didn't have any. So my questions got all kind of, at first they seemed to me to be about a movie that hadn't been made because the way they were going to advertise it already gave it away. So that part was a little off, but I was very, very impressed with Spielberg's ease, with his openness. He was a guy who was going to become very powerful in the film business. And the guy had a big heart. Until I made this one criticism. And I said I was disappointed. Raiders of the Lost Ark. That was the first Indiana Jones movie, right?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it was.
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
When Indiana Jones is running away, the whole thing with Arab-looking people, and running away, and a guy flashes a whip or a sword at him, and Indiana Jones was kind of bored, and he takes out his gun and just shoots him.
Right.
And I said, that wasn't exactly heroic, if I'm supposed to believe this guy's a hero. And he got a little miffed at that. He said, well, it's just the way to eat popcorn, or an answer like that. You know, we did like that. But then, when I saw the next Indiana Jones movie, and Indiana Jones is followed by two of these guys, and he takes out his pistol, and he's out of bullets. And so he's got to fight him. And I think I had a little something to do with that.
Well, you know, it's funny because that's probably the most memorable, the scene that most people remember in Indiana Jones is that scene where he shoots the guy after the guy makes a big deal with his sword or whip or whatever. Yeah.
And interestingly, we talked a little about John Cassavetes. And I hadn't met John yet. And he said that when this was in the interview, he said that when he was a young squirt just hanging around Universal Studios, and I guess he had an inn and he was on set, he was watching a scene that Cassavetes was in as an actor. And he must have been watching pretty intently because Cassavetes spotted him, and Cassavetes was a cut, and Cassavetes marched right up to very young Steven Spielberg and said, hi, I'm John, and I'm Steve Spielberg, Mr. Cassavetes, and said, so you're watching the scene, well, how can I do it better? What was wrong with what I did? How can I do it better? Well, Mr. Cassavetes, John put the kid completely on the spot, asking, give me direction. You're going to be a director? Give me direction. So I thought that was a pretty good story on both of them. And another memorable interview. Do we have to tell our listeners who Jack Nicholson is?
No.
He hasn't made a movie in a long time. But just for some background, Jack Nicholson, the most famous movie he ever made, one of the best movies Hollywood ever produced, is Chinatown, where he plays Jack Gittes, the private eye. But he was in many notable films of his era. 5 Easy Pieces, not a movie I liked, but a movie that made an enormous impression on culture. And Prizzi's Honor, and on. His most famous role, probably for today's audience, would be as the Joker in one of the early Batman movies. And he was traditionally had a reputation as a very difficult interview. He's going to give you a hard time. And I was not intimidated at all by that, not because I'm a person hard to intimidate, but because I was always on the interviewee's side. My sense was I'm getting a look at the creative process of this artist, and whether I like the person or not, whether he gives me a hard time or not, or she gives me a hard time, I'm on their side. I want to know something about their process. I want to be able to get them to say something useful to younger people. And he was at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He had a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And I was to meet him in room whatever it was. He was going to meet me there. That's where he'd do the interview. It wasn't his rooms. And I went. My car was down in John Powers. You remember John Powers?
Yeah.
He was a film critic for LA Weekly, and now he's a film critic at Vogue, I believe. I don't know if he's still there, but he has been for a long time. Powers drove me out there. And we were waiting in the lobby. It was supposed to be at whatever it was, 1:45. And we're waiting, and it's 1:55, and it's 2. And I said to Powers, I give a person 20 minutes to be late, and then I leave. So he said, you would blow off the interview with Jack Nicholson? Because remember, Jack Nicholson was at the time quite a big star.
Right. What movie were you, was this around?
Prizzi's Honor.
Okay.
Prizzi's Honor. It was directed by John Huston with Kathleen Turner and Angelica Houston. it gets to be just about a minute before I'm going to leave, and the call comes to go up to room such and such, and I go up. And I get in there, and my tape recorder goes out. It never happened on any other interview, but it would happen on an interview with Jack Nicholson. And he's kind of fuming while I fix the tape recorder, which I managed to do magically. I don't quite remember how, but I did it. And he's being kind of testy, and I'm letting that ride. And I ask him at one point what his influences are when he was a young actor. And he was ready for me. And I admired him for this. He was ready for me. He mentioned two character actors from the 1950s whom me and nobody else had ever heard of. And don't ask me to remember their names now because I can't. But these were really minor character actors that later on I had to look up in my books. And he saw my bafflement and he cackled, and the interview went on from there. But I did get something valuable from him. I asked him, I said, a question I'd like to ask is, what would you say to an actor not unlike yourself coming up now? And he shot me a look and he said, you'll get your shot. Be ready. And I thought that was very impressive, not only for actors, but writers, anybody coming up. You'll get your shot. Be ready. And be ready means do the work, practice your technique, practice what it is. Really work at it every day. Be ready. So that when it's time that your shot comes, and it usually does sooner or later, then you'll be able to give your best at the drop of a hat. So that was Jack Nicholson. Another thing that happened that sticks in my memory was Vanessa Redgrave, the English actress.
Yeah.
One of the best of her generation. When she was quite young, she did Blow Up with Antonioni, and she did a marvelous job as Isadora Duncan in Isadora. If you can ever get a hold of the director's cut of that film, because they chopped it up and then they chopped it up again, but I think there's a director's cut out there. It's a very impressive movie. I only saw it once in the theaters, when it was just coming out, the entire cut. And yet I can replay scenes like in my mind to this day. So she had kind of exiled herself from Hollywood as she got an Academy Award sometime in the early 80s, and chastised Israel for how it was treating the Palestinians.
Yeah, that's a way to kill your career.
Yeah, in Hollywood for sure, and chastised the Zionists for how they were treating the Palestinians. Well, she couldn't get arrested in Hollywood for the next several years.
Yeah, she's a great actress. She's an actress I really admire too. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, yes. When you, for instance, they ran on Turner Classic Movies recently, and I taped it but haven't watched it again. The film Julia.
Yeah.
Which was from William Hellman's memoir, and Jane Fonda at the top of her career and played William Hellman, and Vanessa Redgrave at the top of hers played Julia, and Jason Robards played Dashiell Hammett, Lillian Hellman's love, and it was a top-of-the-line movie. It was really good. And then that thing happened at the Academy Awards, and that was that for Vanessa Redgrave.
Oh, she did it at the Academy Awards.
Oh yeah, no, she did. She said all that at the Academy Awards. Yeah, you know, Will Smith slapping somebody.
Yeah,
nothing on
right.
It was quite a trip.
Yeah,
and so the publicist asked me on the phone, and please, she does not want to talk politics. And I said something kind of snotty, but I didn't mean it snotty. And I just basically said, look, I want to talk to her about something she knows about, which is acting. I got no interest in her political stuff, and I didn't.
Yeah.
It was a master actress, and I was interested in how she prepared as an actress. So I get there just as they're checking into the hotel. It was the Mondrian. They don't have the Mondrian anymore. There's a building. It's a different hotel now. On Sunset, and one of the publicists says, "Why don't you go up to the room with Vanessa, and we'll take care of the check-in, Vanessa, and blah blah blah." So Vanessa and I go up to this hotel room. The the not bellboy, yes, bellboy. I guess they still call them bellboys. Anyway, he was carrying some of Vanessa's purse, Vanessa Redgrave's personal luggage. Ms. Redgrave and I go into the room. The guy comes after, and he starts explaining to me, because I'm the male, about the amenities of the room. Vanessa Redgrave sits on the bed with this Cheshire Cat smile on her face, just wondering, how is this reporter going to get out of this situation gracefully? And the answer was that he wasn't. I was so embarrassed by the guy's behavior and by his assumption that I was with Vanessa Redgrave that I just stood there blushing, letting it play out and leaving. He leaves. She just smirks. And I just say, can we do the interview now? And it was one of my single most embarrassing moments as a Hollywood writer. But she was very, very gracious. And what I remember of that interview that she said was the importance of consideration on the set, especially if you're the star. The importance of considering the atmosphere of the set and absolutely knowing what you're supposed to do and putting other people at their ease, which she certainly did with me once the interview started. So that kind of thing didn't happen often. Usually I was more in control of the situation, but you never know what's going to happen next in Hollywood. But there was, with interviews, a sense of a lot at stake. You wanted the person to do well. I wanted the person to do well. Mm-hmm. I wanted to do well.
Right.
And this is something that's going to be read by Hollywood and by your peers. And if my interviews were ever collected, I wanted it to be a good collection, a representative collection. When Francis Ford Coppola was making, or just made, One from the Heart. Now, One from the Heart, he made at his own studio.
Yeah.
And it was the first movie made in the process that everybody uses now with electronic equipment instead of film. And he wanted, and he shooting, where the director is seeing on a screen the film as it's being shot. This was one of the first movie by a named director to be directed that way. Huh. And I think that's true. And it was certainly controversial at the time. He recreated the Vegas of that period in the studio.
Right.
So it was a completely studio film. And that was rare. People were doing locations. They'd been doing locations for 3 decades. And if you watch the film, it's very true to the Vegas of its time. but it's also completely studio. And
I
he
love
wanted to do it.
I love the vibe of that movie though, and it's I really like that movie, and it totally disappeared. And I think the fact that he did shoot it in a studio, it gives it that vibe somehow.
Yes, yes, it's got a kind of glowing,
Right.
vibrant that you're never going to get out in the street.
Yeah.
It's a studio picture.
Yeah.
And everybody's very good in it. Raul Julia, Terry Garr. What's the name of the other actress in there? You know who I'm talking about.
I can't remember because I haven't seen it in, I don't know, 25 years, man. They really never show it.
I remember the ad. Ingrid wasn't. No, it wasn't. Wasn't Ingrid Bergman's daughter. It was somebody else's daughter. Anyway.
Not Nastasha Kinski.
Yes, Nastasha. Yes.
Really?
Kinski.
Oh, wow.
I think.
Yeah.
And he was getting a lot of crap, a lot of really bad publicity.
Yeah.
And he comes into this room at his studio, and I'm sitting there, and I got my tape recorder, and I had a big envelope that had my name on it. It had been sent to me, and I carried it from the weekly. I don't know why I was carrying it, and it was just with my stuff. And he looked at the envelope, and he said, and he tapped my name. He said, "Are you him?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, good." It was like, oh, I'm going to have a conversation. and I enjoyed having that reputation, I must admit.
Yeah.
And the sad thing about remembering this is he was talking about the films he wanted to do. He was talking about with a lot of excitement about this new method of making a film. And except for a couple of films, and Rumblefish was one of them, basically his career as a big filmmaker was over. And he didn't know it yet. Of course, I didn't know it yet. Nobody did. But when I read over that interview, as I did, I don't know, 10 years ago, I realized, this is sad. This guy, if you're reading this in retrospect, and you're reading his plans, and you're reading his hopes and dreams, really, he was never going to be given that kind of picture to do again.
I never thought of it.
Godfather 3.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. He made Godfather 3, and he made Dracula in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And then after that, I can't remember.
It was over after that.
Yeah.
I mean, Dracula was a well-made picture. I respected it. Godfather 3 was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know, then the mafia saves the Pope, and come on.
Yeah.
And now they're making a big deal about the 50 years of Godfather, but One from the Heart was his last big personal movie, and to go back and read that interview and think of him, still a fairly young director, really. He was about my age, so he's in his 40s, and he is wincing under the criticism he was getting from Hollywood, and hurt, I believe, because people were really threatened by this new technique. And he didn't realize, I think, that instead of welcoming this new technique that gave you all kinds of flexibility that the camera hadn't had before, everybody was thinking about, is this going to put me out of a job? And in the industry, they didn't want the change. It was forced on them, just the way sound was forced on them 40 years before. And so he hit a brick wall. He hit a brick wall creatively. He hit a brick wall emotionally. You know, it was a feeling like he didn't have a chance to grow as an artist after that. And he had begun as an artist, not only a commercial film director. I don't mean he made art films, quote unquote, but you know, The Conversation,
right,
which he made after Godfather 1. You know, it's a powerful, dark statement about things that are still current today if you watch that film.
Yeah.
The whole idea of privacy. You know, he had written the script for Patton.
Yeah.
And it was a career that really should have been about to blossom and mature. And I caught him as though it was on the last real day he had as who he could have been.
Well, to be fair, The Outsiders was a pretty big, I mean, that was a big deal. And I mean, at least for my generation, that was a big deal. And I think those two movies, Outsiders and Rumblefish, are really good. I like a Rumblefish a lot more than Outsiders, but those are good movies.
I thought they were very good movies.
Yeah.
I don't mean to put down those movies, but in terms of Hollywood, those were really, in terms of Hollywood, those were parenthetical movies. He had to go outside.
He did.
Of his range, outside of the usual filmmaking process,
outside of the city
that got the money together. You know,
who was filming in the Midwest back then? You know, who filmed a movie in Tulsa back then?
Yes, and filming in that kind of film. I mean, he even made it in black and white, right? Rumblefish.
Yeah.
And he did it very well in black and white, but black and white also meant low budget. You're not having all the hassles of color film.
Yeah.
All the hassles of the lab work, all of that expensive stuff. It's a simpler process, and you got to be even better in a way to do it. But in terms of production, it's a simpler process, and so they weren't, in that sense, studio films. They weren't Hollywood films. And his chance to do the big film never recovered, probably because Godfather 3 was such a mess.
Yeah. How was One from the Heart received besides the technical thing?
I don't think it was well received, actually. I want to be accurate about this, but it was not a big film. It wasn't a big box office film.
Right.
It didn't have big stars. It had really good actors, but they weren't big stars. It was the kind of film where the film had to be the star, and which is something Spielberg talked about when I interviewed him. That the film had to be the star. When he made Jaws, the people in it were not stars. The whole concept was the star. The same thing with Close Encounters. The same thing with E.T. And Indiana Jones. Harrison Ford had been the star of Star Wars, but Indiana Jones put Harrison Ford on the map in a whole different way, because he carried that film where the special effects were carrying Star Wars. So my recollection of how it was received is sketchy, but I know it was not a big picture. If it were a bigger picture, you'd be able to find it today.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Do you kind of, like, let's say Cimino, De Palma, Bogdanovich, those guys who really take off in the 70s, and then they kind of go through a dip at that same time. would you kind of put him in, is that like a trend or a genre that you would put him in a way that, like a change in the culture that happened?
Each of them, like Cimino, he had The Deer Hunter.
Yeah.
It was the first film I reviewed for LA Weekly. And I didn't get to interview him, but then he got into Gates of Heaven, or Heaven's Gate. And the studio, which at the time was United Artists and was run by a man named David Field, kept supporting him as he went over budget, as he went over time, as he shot umpteen takes of scenes. And actually, he made a very, very good movie with Heaven's Gate, but the studio chopped it up to make it shorter, and it died. And that was it for him, really. He made one movie after that, but basically nobody would take a chance on him anymore. Heaven's Gate was not a successful picture. If you get the director's cut now, you see it's a very, very good picture, depressing as hell, but good. And did he have anything to say? Did he have a vision? I don't think so. The next film was a detective kind of film that also was kind of bleak. And well, with Peter Bogdanovich, it was a different thing. He made good films and bad films, and they were all personal films, and they were all pretty well directed. I mean, you have The Last Picture Show, which introduced a bunch of actors into their careers. You have What's Up, Doc?
Yeah.
That's one of the better screwball comedies
I forgot that he directed that.
And then you have something like Nickelodeon, which was just a total flop. But then he had things in his personal life, his girlfriend got murdered and all this, that would be hard for anybody to recover from. And when I interviewed him, he was very, very open about all of it. And about trying to put his life together after the death of his girlfriend.
Wow, that must have been a really interesting interview.
I don't really know if it was or not. It was, I didn't expect him to be so personal, and I'm not a therapist.
Right.
And there were parts of it I didn't use because I thought he wouldn't want me to. They might have been sensational or something. I didn't want to go there. I was interviewing him purely as a filmmaker. And I don't know whether that disappointed him or didn't disappoint him. I know that when we ran into each other, he remembered my name and I remembered his. So that was I know we had some kind of a connection.
Where did you interview him?
I interviewed him for LA Weekly. And it was before I did Love Streams, because when he came on the set, we were friendly. We knew each other already. So it was before 1983. And then I interviewed him again. So I'm pretty sure I interviewed him twice. And I was just I was just on the verge of remembering something I was going to tell you about interviewing. Oh, okay. Remember Nicolas Roeg?
Yeah.
Man Who Fell to Earth.
Right.
Walkabout.
Yeah.
And Bad Timing.
Yeah.
Which is amazing film. It's depressing as hell, but it was an amazing film. I love The Man Who Fell to Earth and Walkabout. And he made what I thought marvelous film. the title of which is escaping me, but doesn't have to, with Teresa Russell, whom they were married by that time, playing Marilyn Monroe.
Where she's with Albert Einstein and Insignificance. Yeah.
And so there's Albert Einstein.
Yeah.
And there's Tony Curtis playing a Senator McCarthy figure. There's Gary Busey playing a Joe DiMaggio figure. And there's Teresa Russell playing Marilyn Monroe, which she does very, very well. And so Insignificance had come out. I liked it very much. And I thought it was a very gutsy picture and very well done. And we met at the Beverly Hills Hotel in Beverly Hills, and the one on Wilshire, just off Wilshire. And we met at the bar, and I did the interview with my tape recorder, and we were both drinking a lot. And he said all kinds of things into my tape recorder.
Yeah.
that I never intended to use, but the tape was running. And he called me frantically and said, "Look, Ventura, it's really important." And I tried to calm him down. I said, "Mr. Roeg, I'm not that kind of a writer. I don't do that. But you're going to be worried about this until you see the interview. So all I can do is promise you that I will personally, special delivery," which is what they had then, have the interview, special delivery to wherever you are in the world. You'll see the interview and you'll know you have nothing to worry about. It'll be just you as a filmmaker." And he kept on pleased and da 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 da. And I said, "I promise you, this is what I'm going to do. You know, you've never read any kind of gossip, any personal gossip in anything I've ever written." Because he claimed to have read my stuff, which I didn't actually believe, but that's okay. And so I did that, and he was happy. But that would happen occasionally. In the interview I did with Martin Sheen, whom I had met somewhat before the interview at various times over the years. And I forget what movie he was in. He wasn't, The West Wing had not been, was a decade or so in the future. So he wasn't the star with the gravitas that he had with The West Wing. But he told me a story of, it's in the interview, at the beginning of Apocalypse Now, he's in a room, he's going nuts, there's sort of masturbatory stuff, there's alcohol, there's hallucinogenic, and apparently the shooting went on for a while, and everybody on that set was famously high on something, and Coppola was kidding around with him and said, "Martin, I could make you look like Donald Duck. I cut this, right?" And Martin said, "Yeah, but that would make you look like Walt Disney." I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah.
And that was the other thing about Coppola, going back to Coppola. He'd made Apocalypse Now, and like Cimino with Heaven's Gate, Apocalypse Now had gone way over budget. It had all kinds of problems, and the full cut wasn't released until years later, Apocalypse Redo. And the full cut is much better than the first. That's not always the case, but it certainly is in that film. For instance, in Blade Runner, I like the very first version of that film way better than either director's cut that came out later.
Yeah, me too.
It has the voiceover. It's a good voiceover. It fills in some blanks. In fact, just about a month ago, we tried watching the final director's cut, I think it's billed as. And it's a director's cut in that it lingers over a lot of pretty shots.
Yeah.
But you totally lose the narrative, at least I did. You know, it's not like we don't know the story. We know the story. But it was going on from one series of pretty shots to another, and whether he was trying to make it, you know, more poetic or whatever, the first cut, the studio cut, for once, is the best. And to talk about another interview, the one interview that I was really intimidated by, and that was John Huston. And John Huston, as you know, I mean, wrote and directed The Maltese Falcon from Dashiell Hammett's book, or Treasure of the Sierra Madre, The African Queen, you're talking Bogart, you're talking early picture Marilyn Monroe, The Asphalt Jungle, and then he makes The Misfits, which is a movie that deserves much better reputation than it has, which is Clark Gable's last film and Marilyn Monroe's last film, and you've got Montgomery Clift. You've got three of the best movie people that ever were on screen in one picture, in one scene. And you have this guy, Walter Huston. I mean, John Huston. Walter Huston was his father, a great actor, who plays the old man in The Treasure of Sierra Madre. So this is a guy who's been around. This is a guy who has been in 3 different incarnations of Hollywood.
Yeah.
This is a guy who resurrected his career. I saw him just as he was in the process of doing that, and managed to make several other good films before he died. The very last one, I believe, being The Dead, the James Joyce long story. It's not quite a novella, and it's not a short story either. And I met him when he was doing Prizzi's Honor with Jack Nicholson and Kathleen Turner and Angelica Houston. I think Angelica Houston got a Supporting Actress Academy Award for that.
I think so. Yeah.
And I was intimidated to meet this guy.
Yeah.
Because this is old school, you know. And he'd been interviewed 1,000 times, and well, he's at the Beverly something hotel, the one on Sunset, and in those days I had this ratty blue jean jacket and I wore a red bandana, and they weren't even sure to let me into the hotel. And his assistant and sometimes collaborator in writing, Dorothy, I can't remember her last name now, came to the door, and they didn't have a swank room in the suite in that place, but it was nice, you know. It's the Beverly Hills something or other, and he comes into the room, and he's very, very tall, and he's bent, and I had read his book called An Open Book about directing, so I was prepared, and of course seen many of his movies, and movies that you can't make The Man Who Would Be King again, you know, and that kind of thing, but you know, it's hard to name a name actor that he hadn't directed. And he's very charming. He sits down and we start talking, and he gave me a compliment, I don't mind saying. He says, well, usually they just ask me about Bogart and Monroe. But I was saying to him, so what is the most important scene that you feel in the film? And he said, the most important scene, he said, and I was taught this by my first producer, the most important scene in the film is the scene you're shooting. And I thought if I were a young director, that would be very useful. And he was talking. I said, "How does Hollywood now, compare with Hollywood as it was?" And he said, "Well, these aren't people you'd care to spend the weekend with." And this is a guy about to go into meetings with these people.
Yeah.
And he didn't care what he said. But, in that old Hollywood, of course, people would have weekends, at somebody's estate or something, sort of imitating the weekends people supposedly had in England. And you'd be invited to the weekend with a bunch of other people. It would be kind of an event. You'd be a couple of breakfasts together, teas, lunches, tennis, whatever, riding horses. They're not the sort of people who would care to spend the weekend with. And he told me something. I read a lot about Marilyn Monroe, but I didn't ask the question about Marilyn Monroe, which he complimented me on, as I said at the end of the interview. But he said, the camera sees what the eye doesn't see. And the eye sees things the camera doesn't see. It's not that the camera tells the truth. The camera tells you its truth. For instance, he said, Marilyn Monroe photographed 10 pounds lighter than she actually was. On the set, we would see, he's talking about the misfits. On the set, we would see this blousy, somewhat overweight person who was overacting. We thought. But then you look at the dailies, and she's perfect. Absolutely perfect. She knew exactly what she was doing. And you would say to yourself, he said, something to this effect, you'd say to yourself, how can I be watching her on the set so sure that she's blowing the scene, and I see it on the screen in dailies, and she's absolutely on the money. And she knows what she's doing. And she knows what the camera is seeing better than we do. And so I'd never made that distinction before, that the camera sees what it sees, and the eye sees what it sees, and they're different. And if the camera can look at you in a certain way, then you're a star. And if it doesn't look at you in that way, then you're not. And a lot of it is skill, but a lot of it is some magic between the camera and the actor. And very few, obviously there's not many Marilyn Monroes, there's a lot of wannabes, and there are people who are her equal as an actress, so she was a much better actress than she was given credit for. But still they don't have that thing with the camera. And to make an example of that, I had an interview with the French director, Bertrand Savanier, and his brilliant actor, Philippe Noiret. And I was a big fan of Philippe Noiret's acting in the Tavernier film, for instance, The Clockmaker. And I had the two of them, this cafe in Westwood, outdoors, and they were talking to me about American actors. And they said, American actors, most of them do not understand the technique. They do not understand what goes behind the camera. They just get up there and they act. For some reason, they didn't know the reason. European actors are very aware of the technique. And they gave me this example. Philippe Noiret did. It was a big circus movie one of those serious circus movies that he had a good part in as a ringmaster, I think, but that starred Sophia Loren. And they're coming out. She's on an elephant, string of elephants. They have all this elaborate set. Because to film a circus, you basically have to do the circus. It's very hard to film it indoors, and very expensive, and everything is going smoothly until Sophia Loren says, "Wait, cut, stop." It's like the director's going, "What the hell?" And Sophia Loren says, "We have to shoot it again. My spotlight isn't on. The spot that's supposed to be on me is not on. Well, you looked up and all you saw was all these spots, and how does she know the spot isn't on? You get somebody to go up there and check the lights. Her spot wasn't on. And somehow she knew it. And she would have shown, it wouldn't have been the shot they wanted. They wanted her to be glowing more than the rest of it. And she knew the light wasn't on. And Philippe Moret and Tavernier said, an American actor just isn't going to do that. They're not going to know that.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's true of all American actors, but I thought that was a pretty impressive understanding of technique on Sophia Loren's part, and a aspect worth remembering.
Is there many other foreign directors that you interviewed?
I interviewed Jean Monroe, the actress and the director, after she directed L'Adolescente, The Adolescent. Very good movie about a coming-of-age young woman in France. And it was at a hotel on Sunset Boulevard. I can't remember which, and she had a pool. And we were sitting around the pool. Not my kind of environment generally.
Yeah.
But and she told a wonderful story about Orson Welles. She was in the movie he made of a Kafka novel, and she had told him, "Orson, I want to direct." And Orson had said to him, said to her, "Don't direct unless your life depends on it, unless you can't live without directing that picture." And she thought that was very good advice. And again, there's a sadness. She talked about movies that she intended to make, which she never did. It's one of the vulnerabilities, the nakednesses of being an artist, is that you're going to expose yourself one way or the other, whether you want to or not, if you're going to talk honestly about your relationship to your own creativity. And in these interviews that I did, there would be talk of aspirations. They think, well, I'm thinking about this picture, I'm going to do this, and it's going to be such and such and so and so. And it never materializes. And you read the interview years later, and you go, how often have I caught somebody just at that cusp of creativity, and they don't know it's not going to happen. And of course, when they're talking to me, I don't know it's not going to happen. But it makes for a sad collection of interviews, frankly.
Did you ever interview any musicians?
Not. What am I? I interviewed Frank Morgan, the jazz musician, alto sax.
Mm-hmm.
I was the first person to write about Diane Reeves, and she's a jazz diva now. And my friend Butch Hancock, when he came to Austin, did an interview with Butch for the Austin Sun that got some people into the club. But mainly, no.
Yeah.
I interviewed Tom Waits, put him on the cover of the weekly. And he told me, what was the name of that guy? Captain Beefheart. Captain Beefheart.
Yeah.
And that he was influenced by Beefheart.
I remember going to dinner at his house.
Yes. And I said, to him, because he told me about the influences of Beefheart on him. And I said, so I'm coming out of a store in Echo Park, and this big guy comes up to me and says, I remember you. You're at the Armadillo World Headquarters down in Austin. I saw you in the audience. I'm Captain Beefheart. And that over there is the mascara steak. And I said to Tom Waits, he remembered me from seeing me from the stage. I didn't go backstage. I didn't actually meet him.
Wow.
And Waits said, well, Beefheart is the kind of guy, if you turned him upside down and shook him, something of yours would fall out of his pocket.
Well, is there anything else important you want to throw in here?
I'll probably think of it after we stop.
Yeah, we can do it again sometime.
But just the theme that seems to have poked its head here and there, the vulnerability.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. of the creator. It's so easy to be a film critic, and you get arrogant. You're more arrogant than you think you are. You'll say things, write things that are very critical, that, how could this guy make such a bad picture, all this. And yet, the actor giving the bad performance, the director making a bad picture, is putting themselves out doing something that's way harder than what you're doing.
Yeah.
And critics forget that.
Yeah.
And I don't know a critic who hasn't at one time or another forgotten that.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a question. Did you ever were you ever heavily critical of somebody in a really harsh way and then you ran into them?
Yeah. Yeah. There was a film based on Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy called Heartbeat. I believe it was called Heartbeat. With Nick, the tall guy.
Nicolas Cage?
No, not Nick Cage.
I don't know.
No, you know. Do you remember?
It's not Nick Cassavetes.
No, not Nick Cassavetes. I'm going to look for... and not Nick Toshis, and not Nick Roeg. No, I'm not having any luck at all. Wait a second. We will get this. Very good movie that he was in called Cool Stop the Rain.
Oh, Nick Nolte.
There you go.
Yeah.
There we are.
Yeah.
Nick Nolte was in this. He played Cassidy, and I forget who was playing Kerouac, but my review began, and I stick by this one. What a chicken shit movie Heartbeat was. Heartbeat is. And it went on from there, ripping the movie apart, which I thought it richly deserved. Well, the next day after it comes out, I'm at 20th Century Fox, and I'm having a meeting with the head of 20th Century Fox.
Yeah.
And talking about a picture idea, and I like the guy, and we're talking, and he says, "Well, come to lunch. We'll go to the cafeteria." And we're going down, and he knocks on the door, and he probably setting me up for this, but that's okay. That's and he says, "So and so and so and so, I want you to meet Michael Ventura." And they look at me and go, "What a chicken shit movie Heartbeat is, huh?" The director and the producer. And those are things. It's just part of the gig. It's you're going to be embarrassed. You're going to wish you hadn't said it. You're going to just have to take your lumps. I know that.
So what happened?
No, nothing. They glared at me. I glared at them, and off we went. me and Rob. I think he was just testing me, seeing how I do. I did all right. But Paul Mazursky, who was a good John Cassavetes, Sterling Silliphant was having a party. I loved the Sterling Silliphant Route 66s that you and I watched reruns of when they were shooting, and when they were doing reruns on Nick at Night in 85 and 86. And Silliphant became a friend of a kind. I was very grateful to him for the influence he had on my writing through the 66. And he was having a party, and Paul Mazursky and I had met at John's. When John was shooting Love Streams, people would just drop in. Peter Bogdanovich, Paul Mazursky. They'd worked with John. They knew John. They knew the way he shot. And, the shoot was somewhat of a party. And anyway, I had met him. But Mazursky had just put out a movie that I panned. I thought I'd panned it sort of gently because, he wasn't a friend, but he was a friend of a friend, and I didn't like to knock anybody too hard unless I really thought they deserved it, like with what those guys did with Kerouac and Cassidy. But, so Paul, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite writers, Michael Ventura. We shake hands, and he glares at me, and he says, "He's not one of my favorite writers tonight." But he was classy. He said, "So how's John?" And we both knew John was very ill at the time, so we could talk about that. Because Mazursky did make a wonderful movie with John and Jenna, The Tempest.
Yeah.
And that's a movie that gets better every time I watch it. So, if you're in the business, that's going to happen. Because Hollywood still, or at the time anyway, was still a small town.
Yeah.
You didn't know who you were going to run into at a party. Somebody you'd put down, somebody. Also, there are things that I wrote that I'm not proud of. I don't even want to say who the actor was, but I described him saying something like a German Shepherd would have done just about the same in this role. And he didn't deserve that. That was me being a wise guy, And somebody wrote in, a friend of his wrote in, castigated me, and I deserved it. And it's terrible when somebody writes a criticism of you that you know you deserve.
Yeah.
That you wish you could take back. But if you're in this gig, that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And, in other words, you're going to give a bad performance too. And people are going to see it. And call you on it. And I guess as it should be.
Okay, well, why don't we cut it there. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.